Hello friends, good morning one and all. I will discuss today with you the purpose of literature review. Those who are doing research, they know the importance of literature review. So literature review basically means it is reviewing the literature. But literature is a very broad term. So every researcher, they work on a specific subject or topic or theme. And these researchers must know what is that on which they are doing the research, and that is called the unit of analysis of their research. So every researcher must understand the unit of analysis. Unit of analysis, as I said before, it is the point of inquiry. What is that the researcher is inquiring about? So this unit of analysis, the identification of unit of analysis will help the researcher to identify the literature. So literature basically means it is the past work. I mean, on that unit of analysis, what are the past work that has happened? And researcher must collect the past work, and this work is in the form of article, books. There are different sources of work, and every researcher must go through all these sources. Now after collecting the literature, the researcher must start reading and start reviewing. So initial reading will help the researcher to identify what is the right literature for that piece of work and what is not the right literature for that piece of work. Then after that, the researcher must review it. So review basically means it's a critical engagement, right? So reviewing literature or literature reviewing means the researcher must know what is a critical engagement and what is the contribution of critical engagement. Now let's come to know or understand what is the significance of critical engagement. Now critical engagement basically enables a researcher. Enables to what? Now enables to find out what is already known about the area of research. That means the researcher should not repeat the work. The researcher must know what is the updated knowledge on that specific area. Primarily, the researcher is trying to avoid the repetition. So that's why the researcher is in a need of knowing the updated knowledge on that area. Then this critical engagement helps the researcher to realize the research gap, to know the theoretical and methodological approaches of the past work. I mean, what are the methods and theoretical approach the authors have used in their works, to understand the analytical framework and strategy of other researchers. And this critical engagement also helps the researcher to compare and contrast the different sources and opinion of the experts. It helps the researcher to put the research in an appropriate context. This critical engagement also helps the researcher to learn the language and vocabulary of that research area. Every research area has its own unique language and vocabulary. And this critical engagement also helps the researcher to find different variables. It helps the researcher to think and define research question, to identify the link between the theory and practice. So this is the contribution of critical engagement to the researcher. So researcher needs to be critical because of following reasons. As a researcher, why I should have a critical approach? I should have a critical approach in order to get these benefits. Critical engagement basically enabling me to get these. Now, how to become critical? So, when we say critical, Do we mean it is a negative term? No, in research, critical is very much positive and it means to evaluate. So evaluating what? Evaluate data, information, knowledge of other researchers. And to do a critical analysis of a particular literature, the researcher needs to ask some questions to the authors or producer of that literature, and then some question he or she should ask to himself and herself. Of course, the researcher cannot ask the author or producer of that literature directly because that person is not there before the researcher, but certainly the work of that person is there. That means the researcher has to look the work of that author or producer of that literature very carefully at the source of literature and think about how and why the author has written and produced in that way. So for that, the researcher must understand the lines and the between the lines. So that is very, very important. So after knowing the author and literature from his or her work, the researcher must also ask question to himself. And why he is asking, I will tell you what are the questions the researcher should ask to the author and to ask himself. And why the researcher is asking question to himself? Now, in order to understand his own values as a researcher. Every researcher is also a subjective individual. They have their own subjectivities. They are having their own values. And researcher wants to be value free. So that's why the researcher is asking this question in order to expose his or her own values. Now let's move. What are those questions? So these are the questions to the author or producer of a literature. The researcher must ask, why did you write this? Who did you write it for? What was your purpose? What questions were you asking? What answers did you find? What is your evidence? And what is your conclusion? Now, if you closely observe these questions, asked to the author, one can find as if the researcher is doing a postmortem to that piece of work by that author. And the postmortem can be done only when you ask these questions, you try to understand lines and between the lines of that, literature, of that work of that author. Then after that, the researcher should also ask question to himself or herself. And what are these questions? Now, why am I reading this? Was it written for me? What am I looking for? What questions am I asking? Do I find answers credible? Do I accept evidence? Do I agree with the conclusion? See, look every questions critically, you will find as if the researcher is doubting himself, his own understanding. And why the researcher is doubting his understanding? Now, in order to become the value free. And all these questions by the researcher to the author and to himself or herself make him or her as a critical thinker. Right. Why all these questions are being asked by the researcher to the author to himself? Because by asking all these questions, the researcher can become the critical thinker, right? Thereby, the researcher will make himself enabled to find, to find all these, right? Let me go back to this slide. So these are all these researcher can, let me use it. So these are the things the researcher can get it only when the researcher becomes very critical, right? Okay. And after researcher becomes a critical thinker, then ultimately the researcher will be able to get or develop the following things. The researcher will able to develop the research questions, the research objectives, the hypothesis, research methodology, scope and significance of the study. So what is the purpose of the literature review? The purpose of the literature review is to find research question, research objective, hypothesis, research methodology, scope and significance of the study. So that's it, friends. I hope that you understood the very purpose of the literature review and how to become, critical, right? How to do a critical analysis, what are the questions you need to ask to the author, to yourself, and why, critical analysis is very much required. I mean, how critical engagement or analysis enable, in which way it enable the researcher. Now, right now, friends, after understanding this purpose of literature, let me give a question for you so that you can write the answer and send to me in my email ID. So the question is this: so friends, the question what I wrote on your screen, you can read it. How the researcher can become a critical thinker? Send me your answer by my mail ID. I have written my mail ID. Hope that you have enjoyed. Hope that you will also enjoy when you will answer this question. So thank you very much. Goodbye.